very extensive figureheads collection, most of which are not currently on display. So the 3 figureheads that we're going to look at today kind of represent the greater story of those items in our collection. And we're going to focus a little bit more on the Lancaster Eagle. I'm from South Carolina. In the South, we say Lancaster. I have practiced over the past several years saying Lancaster, but it will slip out as Lancaster, so just ignore that. So anyway, or don't, or call me out for it, whichever one. So we do have 3 figureheads up in the lobby. Is there anybody who has not seen them? Oh, hysteria. Okay, we'll chat afterwards. A couple people. I would hope that most everybody has at least seen the golden eagle that sits up front. We also have the Mars and the Scottish soldier of the HMS Edinburgh. So we're going to be looking at those over the course of the next couple of minutes. I'm not going to focus as much on the ships and their history, but we have a lot of information in our collection and our library and archives. Highly encourage you to look a little bit deeper into those aspects of it after I'm done chatting. So starting first with the Lancaster Eagle, it was affixed to the USS Lancaster ship. The ship was built in 1858, and it was in 1879 that the ship was being undergoing some repairs and being recommissioned up in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard up in Kittery, Maine, not to be confused with Portsmouth Shipyard right across the Atlantic Ocean. I was going to say the river. Big difference there with bodies of water. This is why maritime history is important. So it was up in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, and it was chosen that John Haley Bellamy was going to be the carver and designer of this eagle. Why an eagle, you might ask? Well, what comes to mind when you think of an eagle? Freedom, liberty, the United States, all of that, and you are exactly correct. An eagle was chosen as the design. John Haley Bellamy was chosen as the carver. He had about 50 years of experience around this point, or over the course of his career, I should say, as a wood carver. So it made sense. He was also from Kittery, Maine. So it was very kind of acceptable to have him brought on board for this task and this project. For a little over $2 a day, again, this is back in 1881 at this point, he spent between the part of 1880 and 1881 carving the eagle. Now I have an image of the back of the eagle over here. This is it in its present state, and the reason I wanted to show the back of it is because from the front it looks like one solid piece of wood that was carved. It was in fact several pieces carved that eventually were brought to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and then bolted together and attached to the bowsprit of the USS Lancaster. This is a view that most people don't get to see, so I thought I would share it with y'all today. It's also other images like this on the collective from different angles, so feel free to take a look. But it's just a unique take on something that from the front just looks so clean and so solid and so massive, but is actually was put together more like a puzzle when it was brought down to be affixed to the bowsprit of the USS Lancaster. Now, John Haley Bellamy, as I mentioned, was a ship carver. Woodworking was his life, his passion, his career. The Lancaster Eagle is his only known surviving figurehead, so we get to boast that here at the Mariners Museum in Park. And it was probably one of his biggest, best, and brightest pieces of work that he got to work on. So just some of these things that I'm throwing out there are great talking points if you encounter guests and visitors, because they are so easily drawn to this piece in our collection when they come through our door. So here's a painting from our collection that shows the Lancaster, and you can see on the front of the ship, the bowsprit, there is the eagle attached to it. Now, if you look at this image here, you've seen I've kind of blown it up. In context of a 250 plus foot ship, how big does this look? Yeah. So I actually have this image up front. I left it with our wonderful docents to show our guests as they come through, to put this massive piece into a context of how small, not large, how small it actually is in comparison to the ship on which it served. So it's really impressive to see it. There's a great book in our library that has really wonderful information on this, and it said that when the USS Lancaster was relaunched with the Eagle affixed to it, that despite the size of it and the golden look to it, you really couldn't see it that well from a distance because it's kind of microscopic compared to the overall size of the ship. So again, just kind of putting in context there that this massive Eagle, and I'll go over the specs of the Eagle in just a couple slides to give you a little bit of an idea if you're not already familiar with how big it is. But I first wanted to kind of show that it's not as big as maybe we think when it's in comparison to the actual ship that it was on. So this image over here, also in our collection, is the only known close-up photo of the USS Lancaster attached to the ship. Do you notice anything different about it?
Not gold.
Yeah, so it's not gold. We don't know when, but sometime during the 20th century, they decided to paint over whatever gold paint or gold leaf that was most likely on there and painted the more traditional coloring to look like an eagle. Not sure why, not entirely sure when. The Eagle was attached to the USS Lancaster for about 40 years. So sometime in that lifespan, they decided to make this move and give it a different look, a more traditional look, so to speak, and really make it resemble an eagle. So, over its time, the Eagle was attached to the USS Lancaster. The USS Lancaster serving all over the world in multiple capacities for the United States Navy, doing a wonderful job. And it's also being done during a period when wooden ships are transitioning or fading out to more iron vessels, eventually steel. This image is taken in 1921, so this is right after the end of World War I, when a lot of advanced technology, a lot of advanced naval technology to be specific, had really been brought about. So if you think about the period of a little event known as the Battle of Hampton Roads, you may or may not have heard of it, but that transition from wooden ships to iron, and then iron over time becoming the new kind of look, feel, and everything for naval warfare. So these wooden ships are being pressed out of service. These figureheads that were kind of the shining glory of these ships during, as the age of sail is coming to an end, are being removed. And the Lancaster is no exception to that. So the Lancaster comes off the ship in 1921. It had been at sea for a long time. If you're out at sea a long time, you're gonna have some wear, you're gonna have some tear. It's gonna look a little battered, beaten, and bruised, and it's gonna need some more repairs. Well, the US Navy decided they didn't wanna pay for those repairs. Why did they need to? So they chose instead to set it aside, and it was eventually sold to a company, the Atlantic Marine Exchange, up in Boston, Massachusetts. It was described more so as a junk shop, and you can see in this image here kind of where the Eagle was resting for about a decade before a little institution known as the Mariners Museum came along. So it's sitting in this junk shop up in Boston for about 10 years, so about 1921 to about 1933, when the Mariners Museum, unfortunately there was no park, so sorry park department, the Mariners Museum in this case, had sent agents all across the globe to acquire items for their new collection and to grow what little collection they had. One of their agents, Earl Smith, is sent up to Boston. He has a check for $1,500 to purchase this Eagle to be brought to the Mariners Museum. The Atlantic Marine Exchange had an asking price of $2,500, and they did not budge at all, especially by $1,000, especially during a period when the Great Depression was still in swing and recovery was happening. So they wanted as much money for this that they could get. During the same period, Homer L. Ferguson, who is the president of the museum, is kind of corresponding with Earl Smith, who again is the agent of the museum in Boston, trying to acquire this figurehead on the museum's behalf. And Earl Smith is like, well, what do I do? They won't budge, they won't sell. I have this check, we have this money. Do we want to go and move ahead with it? William Gatewood, who was the manager of the Mariners Museum, at the exact same time the correspondences with Smith up in Boston was happening, wrote a memo to Homer Ferguson, and in it, he said, I recommend not purchasing. It would be too difficult to display. I love the chuckling because I want everybody to take a second and really think about the lobby right now without that massive centerpiece. It's kind of become the staple to the Mariners Museum and Park. If you Google us, that image pops up. Guests walk in, they immediately are drawn to that. There's so much history to that figurehead. There is so much connection that figurehead has to the history of the Mariners Museum and Park. And I want you to picture if Homer Ferguson had listened to Gatewood, not decided to purchase that, what our institution would look like. We'd have a pretty wide open lobby. The events people might like that a little better, I don't know. But the museum just wouldn't have the same panache, for lack of a better word, in my opinion. Luckily, Homer Ferguson decided he wanted to acquire the figurehead, and they came to an agreement for an asking price of $2,200. That is roughly equivalent to a little more than $40,000 in today's money. So the Eagle was taken apart because the wings were massive. It was shipped down to the Mariners Museum here in Newport News on a flatbed truck, and it arrived February 1934. It did not go inside the main gallery. It was attached, it was reassembled, I should say, and then attached and fastened and secured to the exterior of the building, believe it or not. So for 2 years, the Eagle lived outside the museum walls until they were able to bring it inside the doors, as you can see, or maybe through the walls, as you can see in this image here on that side. That was 2 years later. That was in 1936 when it was finally given a new home inside the main galleries here at the Mariners Museum. These are the original main galleries back in the 1930s, so not the space where it currently rests now in our main entrance that we know today. So, everybody who's been paying attention pointed out that it was painted brown and white at some point in the 20th century. If you weren't paying attention, I'm reiterating that now. In the 1960s, at some point, conservation or conservators, curators, other museum workers of sorts, were doing some work. They noticed the painting, that brown and white, was chipping. It was failing. It was not doing what it was supposed to do. So they started stripping the paint. I believe their intention was to do any necessary repairs and most likely repaint it. But instead, they found that underneath those layers of brown and white paint, guess what they found? Gold, yay! They found evidence that there had been gold leafing. They did a little bit of research, they did a little bit of work, and discovered that at some point, if not in its original form, this eagle had indeed been gold leafed. For anybody who may not be familiar with what gold leafing is, it's essentially taking very thin layers of gold. Think of it kind of, and I'm using this as a very loose example or comparison, think of it like taking strips of aluminum foil and kind of wrapping something in it, smoothing it out, hammering it, using adhesives and other chemicals and stuff to make sure that it stays and that it's protected and stuff like that. That is essentially what gold leafing is. There's no record of how much gold leaf it took to relief this eagle, but they did it. And from that point on, the golden eagle from the 1960s kind of remained in its original form. So it's part of the reason I thought this was a golden opportunity to talk about it. So they're gonna cut the mic now.
Keep her back.
Golden Eagle that we all know and love today, it also had a base attached to it or added to it. It was eventually moved to the lobby, I believe in 1989, and that's where it's been ever since. That book that I mentioned from our library mentions that very few people remember that John Haley Bellamy is the carver of this eagle, but that has been for the longest time associated as being part of the Mariners Museum. So basically, when people used to think of the Mariners Museum, and most likely today think of the Mariners Museum and Park, this statuesque item is one of the first things that tends to come to mind. So very happy and very proud that we get to say we have had this in our collection since 1934. It's nearly as old as the institution, or it's not as old as the institution, but it has been with us nearly as long as the institution has been what we are. So, a couple specs, facts, and figures about the Golden Eagle. Please do not try and lift it. It is 3,200 pounds, and if you do, make sure you lift with your knees, not with your back. It was constructed, as I mentioned, between 1880 and 1881. It is roughly 10 feet tall, but with the concrete base that was added onto it, gave it a boost up to 11 feet 9 inches. It has a 19-foot wingspan. That is pretty impressive. It is meant to represent an eagle mid-flight, getting ready to kind of take off and pursue, its flight and patriotism is a better word. And then it's made out of white pine, again with that gold leaf overlay on top of it. So a pretty magnificent piece that has really been part of the centerpieces of our collection since it's been brought here and then eventually put into the gallery. Now, as I mentioned, the Mariners Museum and Park has several figureheads, over 80 in our collection, most of which unfortunately aren't currently on display. So the eagle and these two here really get to represent that story. So if you're ever out in the galleries interacting with guests, these three items are a really great way to introduce a lot of the history of the Mariners Museum and Park and some of the things that we stand for as well. So these are the two figureheads, the Mars of the HMS Formidable and the Scottish soldier of the HMS Edinburgh. So these are both British class vessels. I have also put some very similar statistics and dimensions of them. They were each constructed in the early 1800s, roughly 9 feet tall. I should say the Lancaster Eagle is one, if not the largest in our collection. So just to give you a kind of size comparison there. The Mars is made of Douglas fir, whereas the Scottish soldier has the similar white pine material that the Lancaster Eagle is also made out of. They were each on the ships for several years. The Mars a little bit longer until it was removed in 1906, whereas the Scottish soldier came off around 1819. Purchase year is what we're going to focus on for these last couple of minutes, 1939. Anybody want to let everybody else know what was kind of taking place in 1939? World War II was just beginning overseas in Europe. Hadn't quite reached our shores yet, but a lot of activity was starting to pick up over across the water at this time. After each of these two figureheads were removed, eventually they were brought to a company and bought by the company, Castle Shipbreaking Limited, over in England. And this company acquired several historical items, several figureheads as well. And they were kind of decorative figures in their garden section. This company, over time, developed garden furniture. That was kind of what their bread and butter was. But they also had a mini museum of sorts where they laid out several historical objects, including many of the figureheads, two of which we have here. Unfortunately, well, let me back up. As I mentioned, Homer Ferguson sent agents all over the globe to acquire stuff to be brought to the Mariners Museum as part of the collection. In the mid-1930s, we had people overseas who came across this company and wanted to acquire several of them. At the time, Castles didn't want to let go of them. As World War II kind of was on the horizon, as money started getting tight for the company, they eventually decided, we'll go ahead and sell about 6 to 8 of their pieces. Homer Ferguson, who also on this side of the pond, was like, well, money's tight, so we'll purchase 3. They purchased the Mars and the Edinburgh and an ornate carving of sorts from a ship called the HMS Alexandria, also in our collection. They purchased those in 1939. They were brought to the museum, and Homer Ferguson had said, we would love to at some point come back and purchase the rest when we have the money. Unfortunately, that opportunity never came. Between April 16th and April 17th of 1941, Germans started bombing England and London and the area where these figureheads, along with hundreds of other historical items were resting, were lost in that bombing, in that air raid, and due to that incident during World War I. It's really kind of devastating to think about, but it allows us here at the Mariners Museum and Park to utilize these 2 items to tell a bigger picture, a larger story, and really kind of remind people of, how important history can be, how lucky we are here as an institution to be caretakers of some of these items who speak for their time period, who speak for the ships that they represent and the people who served on them, and so much more. It really is. A lot of people might just look at them as figureheads, and yes, they are figureheads, but they also have a story to tell, and we get to tell that story, and I'm so happy I got to kind of share with y'all a little bit more information about these 3 figureheads that currently sit up in our lobby. Guests love hearing about this, and I have done a docent training on these items and have left a lot of information that I've covered here and information that I didn't speak on here with Beth and the docents in the volunteer lounge. So if you are looking to get back out in the galleries, or if you have not yet found an object in the gallery that really speaks to you, but you want to start, just getting interactive with guests, this is a great area and 3 great objects to kind of kick that off if you're interested. And then I've also included here, and will be more than happy to share, I also know Jean and Jen in the library also have a ton of information. This here is the book from our library that has a lot, not just on John Haley Bellamy, but the Lancaster and the Eagle itself. Has some great sketchings of some of his wood carvings as well, if you wanted to learn a little bit more about his life and his story. And then the 3 catalog numbers for the items that we just discussed. And last but not least, not just big heads, historic survivors of the Blitz, was a blog post that Jean wrote in 2018. It is in the collection, in the catalog list. Great read, covers a lot of the information that I've also spoke on, and expands a little bit more on Castle Shipbreaking as a company as well. Highly encourage you to read it. It's very well written, very informative. So with that, I thank you all. I will happily answer any questions to the best of my abilities if there are any. Otherwise, thank y'all for your attention. Any questions?
Is there any plans to eventually bring that 3rd figurehead that was purchased out into the museum? Is it worthy of being displayed, or?
That's a great question that I don't have the answer to. Anybody in the audience want to? Somebody on the higher status?
The 3rd piece is not really a figurehead, it's a battle shield. It's quite large. And to be honest, we don't really have an exhibit that it's set up for.
Okay.
But maybe at the Center for Collection, we can make it another centerpiece or something. Olivia?
So, I know we have a very large and incredible figurehead collection. Do you know what other, as far as numbers and quality, are there other institutions that kind of top us on that list? Or if we're talking to a guest about, how great our figurehead collection is there any kind of stats
I know